I think growing up, everybody had that one babysitter who probably wasn't qualified for the job. The type that let you eat junk food and stay up late while watching R-rated movies. For me, that babysitter was named Jeff. Jeff was a 17-year-old who lived across the street from me when I was 8. I got the impression that my parents used him as a babysitter more out of geographical convenience than anything else. He was a last-minute replacement when all other options were no longer available. If Jeff would babysit me, it was a pretty common occurrence for me to end up crying about nightmares where Freddy Krueger was coming after me. My parents would have to go complain to Jeff's parents the next day, and I wouldn't see Jeff again until the next time my parents were in a bind. The last time Jeff babysat me started off normal enough. My parents left in the early evening to have dinner with some of their friends, so the sun was still out when Jeff came over. After much begging on my part, we finally played catch in the front yard. I didn't have any nearby kids my own age to play with, and I love baseball. Jeff wasn't exactly the sporty type. He'd rather be listening to heavy metal music than tossing the ball around. When we went out to get ice cream, he'd play his weird European metal band like Mayhem over the car stereo. As much as I loved the horror films that Jeff showed me, I could never get into the noise that he called music. Because of his lack of skill, the ball ended up just going about anywhere but into his glove. My faithful dog Davy ran back and forth between us like a monkey in the middle when Jeff inevitably missed a catch. Davy, like a good dog, would run the ball down and bring it back to him. I found the whole thing hilarious and intentionally started throwing some real heat that I knew Jeff wouldn't be able to catch. One of those pitches went a little wild and ended up in the middle of the street. Jeff shook his head and shouted at me to cool off while Davy sped off into the road, completely unaware of the car coming his way. Is there anything more scary to a kid than having to watch their dog die before their eyes while being completely helpless to stop it? Thankfully, I didn't have to experience that. The driver caught sight of Davy at the last minute and laid on the horn, and he eventually swerved out of the way. I rushed to Davy's side and I held him tight, so scared at how close I came to losing him. Jeff grabbed me by the shoulder and pulled me back into the yard. You see what happens when you screw around. You gotta be more careful or Davy's gonna end up taking a trip to the farm. What's so bad about that? I asked. Several years before this, my parents had woke me up one morning to tell me that they gave our first dog Dino to the owner of a nearby farm. He was an older dog when we got him, and they said he needed more room to run around and exercise. I hadn't really put it together what it meant for a pet to be sent away to live on a farm. Jeff just kind of laughed at my question, realizing how much of a naive kid I was. "You've never been to the farm, have you?" he asked me. I just shook my head. He told me to put Davy in the house because it was time for a little road trip. We drove for about an hour. I had never been this far out of my hometown before. As far as I could see in every direction, it was farmland. I could picture Dino running around being happy on any of these estates. I really thought Jeff was the best for putting my mind at ease with this trip. But the further out we got, the less appealing the farms became. Eventually we came to our destination and turned down a long dirt road. The buildings on this farm were crumbling and looked completely abandoned. We drove by a house that reminded me of the one from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which immediately made every muscle in my body tighten. I started glancing around at every shadow, expecting Leatherface to pop up and rev his chainsaw at any moment. Jeff stopped the car outside of a massive red barn. Unlike the other buildings in the property, this place was very well maintained. Fresh paint, no loose nails, and if you were a betting man, you would have certainly put money on the door hinges being well oiled. It looked so out of place among all the other desolate collapsing structures which dotted the landscape of this farm. The blaring car horn brought me out of my train of thought. Jeff was trying to get the attention of whoever ran this farm. I craned my neck and I looked up to the barn, which seemed to stretch upward forever. A few moments later, a middle-aged man slowly exited the front of the barn and gave us a meek wave. Ready to see the ultimate fate of Davy, Jeff asked me with a wicked grin. We both exited the car and walked up to the man I presumed to be Stan. He was an odd-looking man. He was lanky and he should have been tall, but his permanently hunched posture made him appear to be short and frail. His hands and face were grimy, and I wondered if this was the only pair of clothes the man owned. His eyes were sunk deep into his face, causing a dark shadow that made his gaze menacing. I hung close to Jeff. "Hey, Stan," Jeff said. "We came to see the museum." At this, Stan's features lightened. He produced a goofy grin and shook his head in excitement. It was unsettling and welcoming, all at the same time. Even as a kid, I could kind of sense a kindred spirit of sorts between Jeff and Stan. They were both outcasts and seemed to understand each other in a way that I never could. I followed them into the barn. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. There were animals everywhere. They laid perfectly still, and it felt like every single pair of eyes were staring at me. Stan explained that people would bring their pets to him when they died, and he would artfully preserve them. He would skin the deceased pets, use chemicals to preserve the skin, and then mount it on a wire base. We slowly walked around the massive room, which allowed me to get a closer look at each of the pets. Every single type of a dog, a cat, ferret, and even a potbelly pig were represented. It wasn't really scary, and it actually started to settle my nerves. It was almost peaceful, seeing all of those pets preserved forever so that their loved ones could come to Stan's museum and visit them. After we had seen everything, Stan ushered us through a door and into a hallway. There were several rooms on each side as we walked down the hallway. They were unlit, but I could still make out that they held more taxidermied pets. Each room had to hold at least a dozen animals, in addition to the 100 or so we saw when we first entered the barn. At the end of the hall, Stan pointed for us to enter a room and then turned on the light. It took everything I had not to scream. This room was not like the other ones. I found myself face to face with death. Real death in all of its ugly detail. While the other pets had been preserved to resemble themselves in their prime, this room housed pets who met violent ends, and Stan had preserved them just the way that they had died. I saw dogs that had been hit by cars, a cat who had lost a fight with a larger animal, and a bird that had been used by a demented child to practice his aim with a BB gun. Stan explained that, in addition to the normal taxidermy procedures for the skins, he used a different preservation process for these special creations. He called it plastination. It involved removing the fat and oils from the deceased animal and replacing it with plastic. This allowed for him to preserve the guts and muscle tissues that I saw spilling out of these poor creatures. I was nauseous. I wanted to run from the barn all the way back home where I could hide under the covers until my mom could comfort me. But Jeff held me in place. I looked up into his eyes and I could see that he was in love with Stan's creations. He was transfixed by what we saw in that room, eyes darting from one gory mess to another. And Stan noticed it too. "You've visited me before, haven't you?" Stan asked him. "A few times. I really like what you do." Stan looked down at me and could see the unease on my face. "Do you want to see my private collection?" Stan asked Jeff. His eyes lit up at the offer. I wanted this to end. I prayed that Jeff would say no and we could finally go home, but instead, he eagerly accepted the offer. "Why don't we leave the little one?" Stan said, indicating to me. "My work isn't for everyone." Jeff looked down at me as if he had completely forgotten I was even there. "Is that okay? I'll just be a minute," he asked me. I couldn't believe that Jeff would just abandon me like this. Up until this minute, Jeff had seemed like a superhuman figure in my tiny world. That feeling evaporated instantly. I couldn't even find the words to answer, and I just nodded my head in affirmation. My body began to tremble as I watched the two walk out of the room and up a flight of stairs to another level of the barn. I was left in the room with these dead nightmares. As quickly as I could muster, I ran from the room and back into the hallway. I quickly made my way back down the dimly lit hallway, all the while half expecting that if I turned around, I'd be face to face with one of those monstrosities that Stan called art. When I finally got back outside and to the car, my heart stopped racing. I was still nervous, being all by myself in this strange place and surrounded by death. For the first time, my thoughts went to my old dog Dino. God, poor Dino. I hadn't seen him in there, but there were so many rooms we never entered. Would my parents really allow this monster to turn Dino into one of those things? No, it couldn't be. Dino was somewhere out there, living a happy life on another farm. I could almost believe the lie. Suddenly, without warning, Jeff came running out of the barn. "Get in the car, now!" He barked at me. I did exactly as I was told as my heart rate once again raced upwards. Jeff threw the car into reverse and sent gravel flying back as he raced away from the barn. I saw Stan walk out and wave us goodbye while wearing a weird grin on his face. The entire trip home was made in silence. Part of me wanted to ask Jeff what had happened in there, but I kept quiet. What had he seen that made Jeff scared enough to come running? Even after we got back home, Jeff wouldn't talk to me. He put on the TV and we silently watched it until my parents came home. He was paid and he left without a word. I never saw Jeff again after that. Every night that week, I woke up screaming because of nightmares. Horrible nightmares where undead dogs were chasing me. I had to tell my parents about Stan's museum. They weren't happy about it. I had figured that was the final straw, and that was why Jeff never babysat me again. Recently, I found myself remembering this whole horrible experience, and I looked Jeff up. I wanted to re-establish connection with him. Jeff didn't have a Facebook account, but there were countless old local newspaper articles about him. And about Stan. Stan wasn't just practicing his art on dead pets that were donated to him. It turned out that many were stolen. Dug up from fresh graves or snatched off the side of the road before a family even discovered what had happened to their pet. Stan also made frequent trips to the graves of the recently deceased at nearby cemeteries. That is what the second floor was filled with. Stan's private collection was made up of the preserved bodies of dead humans, including the body of Jeff's little sister. She had disappeared when Jeff was young. I don't know if Stan was responsible for the murder. When Stan was questioned, he claimed that he hadn't killed any of the individuals that were preserved in his barn. He had only dug up their bodies. Jeff, my God, poor Jeff. Seeing his sister like that was too much. He had went back to Stan's museum a few days later with a can of gasoline and set it ablaze to destroy everything Stan had created. Stan told the police that Jeff was standing outside the blazing barn, admiring what he had done. When Stan ran into the barn to try and save his creations, Jeff was right behind him. They fought as Jeff tried to stop him from saving a single piece. Jeff must have been knocked unconscious in the struggle. He never escaped the burning building. The fire department found Stan on the ground outside the barn, clutching several preserved dead bodies and blubbering like a baby because he couldn't save them all. The barn had all but collapsed by then. There was no hope of saving Jeff. All they could do was prevent the fire from spreading further. My parents had kept this from me, and I can't really blame them. I feel horrible for Jeff. Despite the trauma that he had inflicted on me that last day we had together, I still cared for him. He was a great friend to me at a time when I needed one. I hope he found some solace in avenging his sister. Rest in peace, Jeff.